The Second Vatican Council still dominates the life of the Catholic Church today. Many church leaders argue that the acceptance of Vatican II is the primary litmus test of Catholic faithfulness, while some Catholics argue that Vatican II was terrible for the church. So was Vatican II good or bad for the church, or something in between? We're going to talk about that today on Crisis Point. Hello, I'm Eric Sammons, your host and editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. As always, I encourage people to like and subscribe to this channel. Let other people know about it. I really appreciate when you can do that. Also follow us, Crisis Magazine, on your various social media channels at Crisis Mag. Okay, so our guest today is John Monaco. He is a writer for Crisis Magazine. I'll put that one first. And he's a doctoral student in theology at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's a visiting scholar with the Veritas Center for Ethics and Public Life at Franciscan University of Steubenville as well. Welcome to the program, John.
Thank you, Eric. Good to be here.
As I kind of mentioned in the introduction, Vatican II, it's like the subject that still dominates the church. It's considered the super council by a lot of people, particularly leaders in the church. It's considered like the nexus of all evil by some Catholics. And it's become somewhat, it's like, why are we bringing up Vatican II again? And I'm doing it because I feel like it's becoming a litmus test. Like, do you accept Vatican II by some of our hierarchy? And so we need to really talk about it. So I want to first just start off with the question of simply, when you hear Vatican II, what's the first thing that kind of comes to your mind? What's the first thing you think about?
I'll say first thing that pops in my mind is change, just the word change, and let that one speak for itself. Yeah,
that's probably that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, change is definitely. I should have thought of that for myself. If I asked myself the same question, what would I say? I mean, change is a good answer. And I would just say, honestly, okay, I'll give away my kind of feelings at the beginning here. Failed experiment might be the first thing that I think of.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so why do you think, like, looking, and you studied Vatican II yourself, why do you think it was called in the first place? Let's go back to like before Vatican II. Obviously, John the 23rd called it, and a lot of the bishops were behind it, even though it was shocking at first. Why do you think it was called in the first place? Do you think it should have been called? But I think more importantly, why do you think John the 23rd thought it should be called?
So I definitely think that it being called was, a lot of the newspapers would say, it took the world by storm, shocked, people. There's an interesting line. I forgot where it is. It's somewhere in, I think it was True and False Reform by Yves Congar. Apparently John the 23rd was reading it, and maybe this was around 1958 or 1959. And he says, reform in the church, is that possible? And he was inspired by Yves Congar's book, True and False Reform. And at the time, there were already things like the liturgical movement. Everyone knows the liturgical movement preceded the council. Everyone knows that, a lot of the ecumenical movement preceded the council. But to have such a central event be kind of announced, I think the first question is, well, for what? Didn't Vatican I essentially nullify the need for any future councils, some would argue? But then other people were probably thinking, finally, this is our time. But I think that it was called, as many commentators will point out, they'll quote John the 23rd, who said something along the lines of like, you had to open the windows so that, the Holy Spirit can come in into a church that was assumed to be kind of musty, lacking vitality, etc. And so I think it was called for that reason, just to respond to the needs and challenges of the modern world.
Yeah, I think that one of the terms you used there caught my ear. It was the idea of reform. And can there actually be reform in the church? I think because of the Protestant Reformation, which, of course, that's the word Reformation. The first thing everybody thinks of course, is the Protestant Reformation, which as Catholics, we know was a disaster and for everybody involved. And so it tainted the word reform. And I know there are even Catholics today who are like, the church can't actually ever be reformed. But that's not really historically true, because, I mean, look at the Middle Ages, particularly, for example, the 11th century. You have the great reforms of like Pope Gregory VII and things like that. So this idea of reform being something that is can't be done or is always a bad thing isn't really a Catholic understanding, is it?
No, and I think Martin Mosbach, he has that line where reform in its fullest sense is a return to form. I always like that, and so in the classic idea of matter and form, matter is the substance, and the form is the kind of vivifying principle of that. In the same way, I think that any reform in the church, which is certainly possible, you mentioned the Middle Ages, I think of Cluny, I think of those monastic reforms. I think of the Catholic, the Counter Reformation, you could even just call it the Catholic Reformation. You see all these movements, St. Teresa of Avila, you have St. John of the Cross, Ignatius of Loyola, later on St. Margaret Mary, and there's certainly reformers in a certain way, insofar as the church, when it returns to form, usually adopts things that are more true to the church's mission. For example, I think of when I think of Catholic Reformation, I'm thinking of the Carmelites. So you had the Order of Carmel, and you had now the discalced Carmelites, those who went around without shoes. That's why they're called discalced. And you had St. Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. In that sense, the reform wasn't making things more lax. It was actually responding to the wild kind of secularization of the religious and returning to a more austere, some would say strict, but I would say more authentic living of the gospel, of the statutes, of the rule of St. Albert, etc. So in that sense, any Catholic reform would always take the form, no pun intended, but it would always take the form of being a movement where the church is kind of getting back to its core, its roots.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, okay, so obviously the church, in one sense, because the church is made up of sinful people, it's always in need of a reform. I mean, it's never perfect. It's never what it's called to be. Yet, obviously, there are certain times in history where a more massive, a more significant reformation is needed. The Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, obviously, an example, 11th century. If you know anything about the 10th century, the 11th century, there was a need for reform. Do you think there was a need for reform in 1960, for example, before Vatican II? I mean, he called it in 59, so right around then. Do you think there was a need for a significant reform in the church, or do you think it was just another case? It really was more like just let's tidy up some loose ends, like sometimes needs to be done.
I think that's really the question that later on, when we talk about kind of Vatican II and its spirit, that's kind of what people return to. So I'll save the narrative stuff for later, but I'll say, in my personal opinion, from what my own research into the Vatican Council and the preparatory periods, etc., it seemed to me that, and I think Crisis Magazine had an article of something about how, like, I don't want to go back to the 1950s,
Right.
like it wasn't an ideal time. In that same way, I would definitely say there was a need for serious reform. And the reason being was because, well, it depends who you ask, but you'll hear people say, well, the Latin Mass, how it's celebrated today isn't what it was celebrated. Those quick low masses, and they were like, you could do them in 15, 20 minutes, and people are just kind of going there and not really. And then to come out, and from the tabernacle, from a separate tabernacle, they'll bring consecrated hosts and distribute to the faithful, that which had no connection to what was going on. The priest could just be starting the Eucharistic prayer when another priest comes out of the sacristy, coming out with consecrated hosts. So I think, like, there was serious reform needed. However, that being said, I think that a lot of the movement that was being done in the liturgical movement, in the theological or ressourcement, I think, did that need a council, or could it have existed essentially on its own? That, I think, that's my main question when I'm thinking of, because you have the different figures associated with Neo-Thomist, Neo-Scholastic movement, and then you have kind of the new theology, Nouvelle Theologie, and you have all this kind of going on. I wonder if there wasn't a council, could these movements have just blossomed, and different directives from Rome, from the Vatican, to kind of like guide them to where they needed to be. Unfortunately, because there was a council, what ends up happening is that certain movements are then like canonized. And so, then you'll hear people say, well, Vatican II threw out Neo-Thomism. Now we have to, return to the sources. Well, that itself is a movement that predated the council. And so reform was needed. Sure, I mean, it's great to read the fathers, and we should be returning to them. But how it essentially gets canonized and baptized even by the council in a way that enshrines it as like the way, I think that's where the reform spirals out of control. So that's a good question, though.
Yeah, I have you read Steve Bullivant's book Mass Exodus?
I have. I think about it actually quite often.
It's an excellent. Boy, it's so good because he doesn't like try to go. He tries to focus on the data, and one of the things I think is real eye-opening about his book is he talks about how the church leaders were recognizing in the early '60s, before Vatican II, there were some cracks forming for this beautiful image we like to make of the 1950s in the church. The fact is, particularly as he mentions, World War II had a great impact on the West, on how people were living, the move to the suburbs, these various factors. I mean, he focused on the United States, United Kingdom. But basically the idea, though, is that the church was definitely weakening, and you can see it in some of the numbers. So there was a need to at least address that. I mean, I think I would argue, and I don't want to jump ahead either, but I argue with you, perhaps it wasn't a council isn't what was necessary. But also, I think one of the problems was, did they really have a grasp of what the real problem was? One of the things that I have, probably one of my biggest criticisms of Vatican II, is that it's very dated. It just comes across as a very 1960s type of thing. And so they weren't necessarily able to get a view of, okay, what's really going on? And what really do we need to address? What's the real problem? It's kind of like the Catholic Counter-Reformation. It took a long, historically we might say maybe it took too long before finally Trent was called and everything like that. But at the very least, you could say that when Trent was called and when Trent ended and when everything happened, they knew everything that was wrong at that point because it had been going on for quite some time. And this is just like starting to form, and they immediately jumped to a council, and maybe then they didn't quite have a grasp of the real situation, why people were leaving and things like that.
Yeah, I definitely would say that. I think Stephen's book, Mass Exodus, definitely kind of shows in the data where the church was kind of slipping through the cracks. You mentioned the move to the suburbs, and I think a lot of it was tied to the culture. And, I mean, so I'm of Italian American descent. And so, we always had big feasts for, St. Joseph, St. Rocco, San Donato. I didn't even know who he was until later. I just saw these old Italian ladies pinning, dollar bills to the statue processing. But the cultural in these little ghettos in the cities, I think like Detroit, the Irish church, the French church, the German church, Chicago, Waterbury, Connecticut, where I'm from, or New Haven, Connecticut, New York, you had like the little enclaves. And once those started kind of breaking, there's the question of, well, what was left. But I definitely think that I think there was kind of a rush to the council. I'm not really sure why. It didn't follow that same trajectory as did Trent. Which, some people would criticize, well, it responded too late. But the question about Vatican II is like, what exactly is it responding to?
Right.
In the same way that you may have like Paul VI, Humanae Vitae, responding to the whole birth control question and the sexual liberation. Like that's a clear, like, here's the issue, here's the response.
Right.
But with Vatican II, there's so much talk about it, and there was so much like discussion. It was like everyone was excited to say something, and then we end up with a council that like covers every topic under the sun, from Revelation, Dei Verbum, to the Church and Lumen Gentium, to the Church in the modern world, and and it's like religious life, priesthood. There was not a single stone that was not turned, and I think not all of those topics needed the treatment that they got, but.
Right. That's a great point, actually, because if you look at most councils, they have a very specific purpose in mind. Nicaea is Arianism or something like that. And Trent, obviously, is against the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah.
Even Vatican I, it had a reason that was very clear cut going into it. But Vatican II, it's like, okay, we think there's problems, so we probably need to do something about it. But there wasn't a clear cut case of what is the actual problem. It's not saying that there wasn't problems, but what is the problem? Do we have a deep understanding of the problem? Because only then can you actually fix something, is if you know what the problem is. And like you said, it almost seems like a grab bag of, okay, let's just talk about how we're going to do things from now on without any very specifics. So let's talk about the council. That's kind of leading up to council. Let's talk about the council a little bit. And I want to, like I told you before we got on, that let's wait to talk about the implementation, the spirit of Vatican II, and talk about the council stuff. Because one of the big criticisms that you hear from people that when anybody criticizes Vatican II is, oh, they probably haven't read the documents. They don't know what actually was said. And I like to show this is my old copy from my days in 30 years ago. And it's like, you can't maybe see on camera, but it's like basically falling apart. Yeah. Okay. There we go. Whoops. Because, I've gone through it a lot. And like, so what I want to ask you first is, considering that kind of what we're saying about the environment that Vatican II was called in, what would you say about the actual documents of Vatican II, what it proclaimed? What would you say were probably the best things about it? Like, what were the best proclamations, probably the most fitting, the most lasting? Now we have 60 years in hindsight since it's been called. What in hindsight did we say were probably the best things that came out of Vatican II itself?
Well, so I would definitely say the best things that came out would include a more broad understanding of a church, not just as like a perfect society, or not just in external forms, but rather as a mystery, a Trinitarian mystery that draws in all the faithful, given their respective roles and duties and callings, but rather the inner life of the church as reflective of the Trinitarian communion. And then following, this is part of where my research focuses on, is following the council, then you have all this kind of communion ecclesiology, but I think it was definitely if Vatican I really just focused on the figure of the Pope, Vatican II complemented that with a more focused study of the episcopacy in relation to the people of God in general. But I think that was one of the shining points of Vatican II, is one of the shining points of Vatican II, is the understanding of the church, which then branches out into the relationship of the Catholic Church, especially with the separated churches like the Eastern Orthodox Church and etc. I would definitely say the appreciation of the Eastern churches from, there were some documents, I believe, of Pius XI and Benedict the 15th, I believe, who had some documents dedicated, like for example, to the Armenians or to whoever, where it showed like, oh, the treasures of the East are manifold. But I think within the Ecumenical Council, the way that they mentioned how all the rights of the church are of equal nobility and dignity. I think that opening the church's understanding and saying like the Eastern churches aren't just these units that are, we tolerate, but rather full vital members of the church and have something to offer to the world, into the Catholic, as to the Catholic witness. So definitely those are some of my favorite documents. Lumen Gentium, Unitatis Red Integratio. You have Orientalum Ecclesiarum, and so you have those that deal with the church, the Eastern Church. And then actually, I think Dei Verbum too is a very, very strong document. It's criticized by some because they don't like the idea of the modes of revelation, how they divvied them up in the document. But Dei Verbum makes it very clear things like the historical critical method and other forms can be tolerated insofar as they respect the mystery of revelation. And so I think not so much because of the historical critical method, like its allowance, but I think Dei Verbum gave a very proper understanding of the church and the revelation bit. There's that part in Dei Verbum where it says something that the magisterium does not essentially create revelation, but rather serves it. And I think that kind of ordering thing, especially today, I think that's very important. So I'd say the document on revelation, the documents on the church and the Eastern churches are very strong. I would say too. Yeah.
Yeah. I it's funny as you were answering, I was trying to think of myself, and I think we have very similar views here because I'm an unapologetic fan of Dei Verbum. I mean, I know I know the whole debate about the forms of revelation and scripture tradition, thing like that. I love Dei Verbum. I think it does a great job of explaining the three kind of pillars of the faith, the scripture, tradition, magisterium. I think Dei Verbum is wonderful. I mean, I'm sure I could nitpick if I really wanted to certain ways, some word, but really, I think Dei Verbum is great. Also, I think I was going to say that I do really appreciate how the Eastern churches came more into their own through Vatican II. I still think there's I still think there's a long ways to go with that. Like, I think it's ridiculous that the Vatican actually has like an office in charge of like the Eastern churches. I mean, that's just not the way it should be. That's just not the way it should be. And things like that. But at the same time, a lot of good progress has been made in treating the Eastern churches as what they should be, which is full churches within the unity of the Catholic Church. We're talking about the Eastern Catholic Church, of course, for people listening. Orthodox Church is obviously a little bit different for obvious reasons. And also, I think that the point about the church, I feel like I'm not quite as enthusiastic. I am enthusiastic. I do like the idea of, like, if you look at Catholic teaching from like the first millennium and even going on, the making it not just a company that the Pope's in charge of, which is essentially what it kind of started to become by the early 20th century, that there's nobody else. The bishops are just middle managers. And when you start to realize that a bishop is a full successor to the apostle and truly somebody who is got a divine mandate in his job, and he's not simply just answering to the Pope and everything. I think that Vatican II really helped with that. It's kind of funny because today, people, under JP2, all the big Spirit of Vatican II people were like, they were like, yeah, it's great. Bishops are on their own. They don't need the Pope. And now, of course, the roles are reversed. And people like me are saying it's, the bishops don't have to,
right.
The Pope. So I get the irony here. But I do think, and I think, honestly, that's actually connected to the Eastern understanding. Obviously, I'm not promoting the Eastern Orthodox view of the Pope's role, but a more full role for the bishops in the community of the church. Am I going to say the word synodality? No, but a more full role, I do think is good, and I think that's part of it. Now, you mentioned Lumen Gentium, and I can't get over, though, some of the howlers, I think, in Lumen Gentium. I don't howler, probably the best word, but like the whole idea of the Catholic Church subsist in the Church of Jesus Christ subsist in, which obviously is a big controversy. But that's not to say the whole documents. I don't want to write off the whole document, but I do think there are some issues with lines like that that make me a little bit less praiseworthy of something like Lumen Gentium than I am with like Dei Verbum. So.
Yeah, I definitely think that I think each of the documents has a particular strong point, and not everything said in the documents, of course, has the same weight, etc. If you want to talk about, its value to the magisterium. I mean, Gaudium et Spes talking about, various kind of initiatives that countries can pursue together is not on the same value as, the idea of, the Eastern churches being true, particular churches, etc. But I do think, though, that where the documents, how do I put it? So the documents are beautiful. They're, in many ways, they're poetic. In other ways, I feel like if you read the text of the early ecumenical councils, they're not nearly as elaborate in terms of their wording. You read Nicaea, you read Constantinople, etc., and they're not these like long essays on the church. In fact, they kind of like zero down or narrow down and pinpoint to the minute detail of what it is for Christian orthodoxy to be exactly that, and its opposite, what it is to be heterodox and heretical. And I think that part of the issues with Vatican II is, first of all, major, huge council, people from all over, major documents, constantly going through like revisions and being voted on, et cetera. And then we end up with these like massive texts, and they're great reflections. But at the same point, it's entirely possible for a person to point to one part of the document and say, well, this, and then another person on the other side of the ecclesiological spectrum to say, well, that, and then whereas if you had like an anathema that said, whoever says that, I don't know, marriage and virginity are of the same, dignity, so to speak, let them be anathema. Well, clearly you have a position that is doctrinal, and you have a position that is being stated in the condemnation way of saying, like, okay, whoever says this, you're wrong. You don't really get that in Vatican II. You have that kind of big tent, big document, long paragraphs, and so it becomes harder to pinpoint what exactly is being said.
Right.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I think actually that's an excellent point, and it kind of crystallized in my own head while you're talking. You see, this is a very modern church way of doing things. There's lots and lots of words. And so the catechism, like the modern catechism, the catechism of the Catholic Church, like there's a lot that's great in the catechism, but it does use a lot of like poetic language and like a lot of words for something that really a catechism. I mean, the Baltimore Catechism said just as much as the important stuff, and it's a lot shorter and a lot simpler. And so like, it opens up vectors of interpretation. And Vatican II is the same way. Like those documents, if they are written by, let's say, some theologian or even a bishop or something as a pastoral letter, you'd be like, okay, great. Because nobody would take a pastoral letter by, let's say, a bishop of Paris, let's say the Bishop of Paris wrote a pastoral letter, and it was Lumen Gentium. Well, people are like, wow, this is great. Lots of good stuff in here. But if there's some things that were a little bit funny, nobody'd be like, whatever. It's just a bishop in Paris giving, pastoral letter. But because it's an ecumenical council, it's like, oh my goodness, we really have to like, nitpick now and parse every single word. And is this, what does this mean? How does this mean that? And maybe one person says this, one person says that. And it just really, whereas something like Nicaea, where it's like, we have a creed, you just say it or you don't. and so, and even, and you see that with Trent, and so I do think that's a very good point. And I think that's the modern way, because you look at papal encyclicals, modern ones, oh my gosh, they are so long and they just keep getting longer. I mean, JP2 really, and the thing is, I say as somebody who I'd read those and they come out and I just loved them.
Right.
It's not that I don't love them, but it's like, wow, there's lots of words. And now, Francis, he goes even to a new level.
Right.
I even thought like when Corleone, when he announced that he was banning Nancy Pelosi from Holy Communion, I kind of was like, he took a lot of words to say that, and it's just like the modern way they do it. And I was like, just say, she can't go. You don't need to have all these words, but I know that's just kind of the way we do things. So I think that, like you said, I think it opens it up to, like the term I just coined, vectors of interpretation that can be problematic. That's for sure. So now so we said what's good. Now of the documents themselves, of what Vatican II produces, of not the implementation like that, what would you probably say are probably the most problematic elements to be found, or not beyond just the fact that there's a lot of things that are said that probably didn't need to be said in a council, but actually that you'd say, okay, this really, the document itself, the way it's worded, I think this is this is at least problematic for bad interpretations, if nothing else.
Yeah, the line that gets me, I think, the most, pulling it up right now, and I think about it quite often, and I think it's something that Peter Kwasniewski mentioned is. So in Sacrosanctum Concilium, which I think every trad Catholic, worth his salt has read it a dozen of times. There's a line. It's number 34, where it's talking about the norms based on the didactic and pastoral nature of the liturgy, which itself is, of course, a point of contention. But it says the rites should be distinguished by a noble simplicity. They should be short, clear, and unencumbered by useless repetitions. They should be within the people's powers of comprehension, and normally should not require much explanation. And that's like the red flag for me in terms of where you kind of see those, because as all documents are, they're composed by people. Even if we believe that the Holy Spirit's guiding the church, sometimes biases can creep through. And that, as someone who now exclusively attends the Eastern rites, I'm just kind of blown away at what is a useless repetition? Who determines that? What do you mean to be understood, in terms of the liturgy? That's kind of one where it's not like a doctrinal, it's a prudential statement, but it's clearly rooted in something that is their vision of the liturgy, which of course will then lead to liturgy wars and all of that. And I think that in terms of Sacrosanctum Concilium, that's like a lightning rod, because you could read it to the letter and end up with a mass celebrated by Cardinal Sarah or Cordileone, and you could see like, okay, they're doing, let's say, the Novus Ordo Mass. Wow, they're following the letter of Sacrosanctum Concilium. There's Gregorian chant. There's this. They're even doing it ad orientem, etc. And then you could have, and as we saw in the responses to Traditionis Custodes, there's people who then say, well, active participation, Sacrosanctum Concilium, and then they're pointing the same document, but completely different liturgies that look like completely different religions at some point. So I think one of the bad parts about Vatican II is not so much the documents themselves, but the weaponized ambiguity, that there's ambiguous statements or even just kind of biased statements that are prudential, which are then clung to, and they end up meaning more than what they would be. I also think, and this was Archbishop Marcel's biggest complaint, was Dignitatis Humanae. And I know Thomas Pink and others have tried to read that in a way that's fully like in continuity with past teaching on religious liberty. But as Bishop Athanasius Schneider would point out, that there's no positive right to error and to religious freedom insofar as it's choosing the wrong. And so I think that those documents, I think, like, for example, I think it's in Gaudium et Spes, where they say that we want a world authority. That's even in Benedict XVI's Deus Caritas Est, I believe, that he talks about like, well, there needs to be kind of like a world authority, which is pointing towards like the modern day UN. I think, again, we were talking about before how the Vatican, they instead of just responding to certain things, it's like they just threw stuff at the wall and said, okay, what's stuck and what's sliding down. And so I think definitely the document on religious liberty, especially with the traditional communities that are going to be more hostile to the council, that's one of the ones that like we just need, as Bishop Schneider would say, maybe a future syllabus of errors, and say this is the one authoritative way to interpret this document. Right. All else. So I think that Sacrosanctum Concilium, the optimism of Gaudium et Spes, and that's pretty much it. A lot of the smaller documents like Ad Gentes, and you have even the document. I think Archbishop Marcel actually loved the document on the priesthood. He thought it was very noble and edifying. I think I remember reading in his writings that he walked away from Vatican II saying like that's probably his favorite one. So again, with a council like this, there's something for everybody. That could kind of be the problem.
Yeah, right. I want to read that 34 from Second Concilium again. The rites should be distinguished by a noble simplicity. They should be short, clear, and free from useless repetitions. They should be within the people's powers of comprehension and normally should not require much explanation. And I want to reread that again because we were just talking earlier about how great it was that Vatican II kind of opened us up to the Eastern churches and the fullness of their of them being true particular churches. There is no more anti-Eastern conception of the liturgy than that paragraph right there. I mean, that goes for anybody who has not gone to an Eastern liturgy, just trust me. This is completely antithetical to that. Now, that being said, I do think it's true that the Roman liturgy has always been marked by a greater simplicity than the Eastern liturgies. It definitely does have that. It always has had that more than the Eastern liturgy does. But the fact that they would put in ecumenical council this very kind of generic way, like you said, could be interpreted so many ways. Like you said, what's in useless repetition? I mean, how many times do you say "Lord have mercy" in an Eastern liturgy? Like 4,000. I mean, it seems like you're saying it over and over and over again. Is that useless repetition? I mean, some people might honestly think it is, but what determines that? Who determines that? If all of a sudden maybe the patriarch of the Melkite Church said, we got too many Lord have mercies in our liturgy, some of them are useless. Is he allowed to then cut some out? I mean, it really does open ourselves up to a lot of issues with that. And so I think I think what you're saying though is a great point, that it's more a matter of it's saying things a council should not say. Like, it's okay if bishops maybe have these opinions and even promote them and say, hey, let's start thinking about this. But a council saying this kind of generic thing that could be interpreted so many different ways, I mean, we see what happens. So you don't have, do you have, okay, I'm just going to put you on the spot here because it's one of my bugaboos, I admit, which is Lumen Gentium saying that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. I mean, I wrote about this in my book, Deadly Indifference, a lot because, and I made it clear that like the church has had clarification after clarification of what that means in an orthodox way. I mean, Ratzinger spent half his career trying to clarify that one phrase.
Yes.
And so like, I get that there are orthodox ways to read that, but in my mind, practically speaking, it was a disaster because what it did was it opened up for so many people the ability to say, basically, the Catholic Church is just one manifestation of the Church of Christ, and then you also have other, the Protestant churches and Protestant denominations and ecclesial communities, whatever you want to call them, that they're also the Church of Christ also subsists in there, and that's explicitly what somebody were saying. And if they had just stuck to the language of the Church of Christ is the Catholic Church, or just not had the line in there, I think a lot of these problems wouldn't have happened. So are you okay with the language like it is, or do you think it's also got some problems? I just throw you right there on the spot.
I remember in seminary, I think we had an entire class in our ecclesiology class where we just read the Lumen Gentium, and then we looked at that part in light of Ratzinger and his kind of understanding. So, I mean, traditionally, of course, this would be the breaking point for many people who say, no, Church of Christ is the Catholic Church, est, not subsist. And I think they had ecumenical concerns, of course, the Council Fathers, where they would say, well, subsists in, but as Ratzinger, as you know, would say, subsisting in is a kind of being. It's like if the church is subject, it stands on its own in terms of this idea that there's a unique singularity or oneness that is the church, in which it exists on its own, the Church of Christ in the Catholic Church, though fragments may be found elsewhere. Do I like it? Well, it somehow makes sense insofar as, so I think it was Robert Bellarmine who would, when his definition of the church, when he says like that heretics and apostates are not part of it, well, of course, the line in the sand is drawn. the same time, I look at like the Eastern Orthodox who we're not in communion with, and I look that they do have a valid Eucharist. And I think if you wanted to be very like militantly uh, neo-scholastic, you'd say, well, yeah, they have valid because it's ex opere operato and apostolic succession, but like completely like it's illicit because they're not in union with Rome. And I think that's, if I were a council father, that would be really the only reason I would choose subsists, because I would acknowledge that there's some kind of churchiness going on there. They're not to be equated with like Jehovah Witnesses or, even like Methodists who are creating their own baptismal formula. Like there's clearly something there. And studies, historical studies about the Great Schism and then what followed, like there's kind of Eucharistic sharing, to use a post-conciliar term, but Eucharistic hospitality between the two. So you'd have in Venice, if Orthodox people came, they could attend the Catholic Church, and there's been some historical studies done on that. Well, there's clearly an acknowledgement that they are part of the church, but certainly separated. Then again, as you mentioned, it opens the floodgates, because then it will just lead to indifferentism. Because what do you gain being, if the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, and the implication is that the Church of Christ is also existing outside of the Catholic Church, then existence is existence. Why not go to that one? So if they had if they said the Church of Christ is the Catholic Church, I don't know if that would have as many negative consequences as what we saw following.
Right.
I really don't know.
Yeah, I feel like it's interesting because I actually years ago wrote a high school textbook on ecumenism and religious dialogue. And the way we structured it was that we kind of started with Catholic Church, and then we kind of went out to how, based on how attached they are to the Catholic Church, so Orthodox first, then Protestant, then you have like Jewish, Muslim, and everybody else. And I really have come to in my own view, it's not just that the Orthodox churches are closer to us. That's true, but they're fundamentally of a different kind than all the others. In fact, we have that in the official language we use. We call them churches, and we call the Protestant ecclesial communities. And then, of course, the Jews and Muslims aren't, and the rest of them aren't even part of anything like anything Christian. So I do think that, and so wording it such that it would kind of include the Orthodox. The problem, though, of course, is that it then, like you said, everybody else kind of jumps in on that. Everybody else can kind of be part of that once you say that the Church of Christ is outside the Catholic Church in some way, or at least imply it. Then it's like, okay, well, then who couldn't be part of the church? Some nice pagan, who follows like his conscience. Okay, now he's part of the Church of Christ. I mean, it just gets very difficult at that point when you do that. So anyway, now one of the things I've kind of started doing in the past few years is I like to talk about the Vatican II event. By that, I mean, there's always the stuff like, oh, you got to read the documents. The documents say this, but then what actually happened is that's the main kind of conservative Catholic critique,
Right?
Is that there's a fundamental difference between Vatican II documents and then what happened afterwards. And so I kind of call it the event, because I feel like you can't truly completely separate those two things, because for one reason, it's literally the same people who are approving the documents that are implementing it later. And also the fact is that, like, I mean, how can you say that the bishops and the Pope who implemented it, that they were wrong there, but they're okay in the council? It seems kind of odd to me. But at the same time, there's clearly a separation in the minds of like a lot of liberals. So how would you kind of marry all that together between the documents, the implementation, the spirit of Vatican II, and all that?
Well, as you mentioned, I think it's a Bologna school of thought that, the historians that kind of examine the council, that would talk about Vatican II as an event, and theirs is the hermeneutic of rupture, where it's like, well, new Pentecost, the old one wasn't good enough, apparently, complete break with the past. This is new. Church did change teachings, etc. And then you have the hermeneutic of reform and continuity, or normally called hermeneutic of continuity, where it's like, well, no, we just read the council documents and then like see how it is just a continuation of past teaching. You have the traditionalists, depending on which side of the spectrum they're on, the traditionalist argument that like this is completely unacceptable, there are errors, or that the errors are prudential in nature, or that we may need a future syllabus itself. I would definitely say though that I've moved away from being a Vatican II apologist who just thinks everything's great about the council and says, okay, just read the documents. The documents are fine. That was kind of the party line when I was in seminary. There was never any criticism of Vatican II itself. All criticism was directed towards its spirit. And there was this kind of, I would say, a naive optimism that if we just read the council documents and read them as a conservative would, then we will see that they were great and that they didn't contradict past teaching. To which I would say that if you do read the documents and read them carefully, or even more, is if you read the schemas from the schemae, I think in Latin would be, but if you read the drafts of what was supposed to be the council documents, and then you see the documents themselves, no amount of reading the documents can satisfy the idea that there's no criticism to be found. Because I definitely think that the event can't be separated. There are clearly those who, and I've written about in the past, that lament right after Vatican II, the council didn't go far enough. We had to negotiate and agree upon this word. I would say like the equivalent is, and I think of the line in scripture where Jesus says, you'll know them by their fruits. I think you could also judge councils based on that, privately, of course. You can't publicly judge that, but in your own reflection. And what I think of is the same bishops, depending on where they were. If you're like Ottaviani and voted on the documents but had very strong reservations, well, then it tended to be that in whatever diocese or ministry that bishop or priest would find himself in, the council was implemented conservatively. But if you were one of the bishops who were there who said, well, it didn't go far enough, well, then you get the spirit of Vatican II. At the same point, it's the same council. And a council that leaves itself, I mean, I kind of think of it too, like when people say, well, the hermeneutics of Vatican II. Well, I'm thinking a hermeneutic, a tool for interpreting something. What kind of council needs one to begin with? In terms of like, you don't really need a hermeneutic to read in Nicaea that Christ is of the same substance as the Father. You don't need a hermeneutic to understand that Trent is responding to completely faulty understandings of the Mass as a sacrifice, a true and proper sacrifice. Even Vatican I. I mean, I'll skip Poster Aeternus and just go to the other document in which they're talking about kind of how the knowledge of God, and this is citing Romans, but how one can come to knowledge that God exists using human reason. So it's like, you don't really need a hermeneutic. It's right there clear. The fact that we have this council where it's like, well, there's different schools of interpretation, it is an event. The council truly is an event. Whether it was a good event or a bad event or a mixing of the two is I think where the debate comes in.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've had a similar evolution as you. For a long time, I just kind of stuck with the conservative party line, I guess you call it, for lack of a better term, of, the documents itself can't be criticized. It's only the implementation. And I think since we already talked about the documents, you don't have to rehash that. But I do think there was, obviously it left open for a lot of these implementations that I think all faithful Catholics acknowledge did not help. I mean, a lot of things that happened after Vatican II, I don't think there's very many serious Catholics who would defend clown masses or whatever the case may be, some of the craziness going on. And then you see, of course, all the stuff that happened after Vatican II that wasn't called for in the liturgy, with altar girls, communion in hand, turning the versus populum, all those various things that There was nothing in Vatican II explicitly that called for any of that, but somehow it was all part of this renewal effort, which ended up having disastrous results. But the fact is that today, if we jump to today, Vatican II has become, in a lot of ways, the litmus test. I mean, Traditio Custodes, which you mentioned earlier, which of course has to do with the liturgy, but really it doesn't just have to do with the liturgy, because Pope Francis made it very clear that his concern is that there's a rejection of Vatican II going on. And you see that in a lot of the bishops when they've implemented it. They've talked a lot about this idea of rejecting Vatican II. In fact, some bishops who have banned ad orientem, they have made that a test of whether or not you accept Vatican II. That if you celebrate ad orientem, somehow you've rejected Vatican II, which is intellectually just
right.
dumb. I mean, I don't know what's the right word, but it's ridiculous. So how do we get out of this idea of like the proper way to look at the council in a Catholic way that is and places it in the context of church history and in our own times?
Yeah, it is a litmus test, right? And I think it's a litmus. I think if everyone's just going to be like honest, they have to admit that Vatican II is not. Vatican II is the occasion of which they can push through whatever they want. So, if conservatives want Gregorian chant in the liturgy, they'll go to Vatican II. If people say, well, we should have ecumenical prayer services, they'll point to Vatican II, etc. I think, first of all, the question is, when you hear people like Pope Francis, for example, saying, well, it's a rejection of Vatican II, my first question is, who's Vatican II? Is this the Vatican II as understood by JP2 and Ratzinger, or is this the Vatican II understood by, I don't know, Cardinal
Cupich?
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking Cardinal Roche, Cardinal Cupich. Right. And in that same way, it's like, okay, well, the fact that there's two varying different interpretations means that there is no unified consensus on it. And then a second point I would add is that there's a kind of, I would call it the Vatican II reduction. This idea, like, well, you'll see all these different letters, etc., and you'll see bishops say, well, as Vatican II taught, and like, I get it, it's the most recent ecumenical council, right? But at the same point, why do you need to keep going back to that council and not, you never hear them say, well, as and Council of Nicaea said, Christ, has
or Lateran III said, or something.
Yeah, exactly, or even something like that, or well, as the Council of Trent taught. Everything is like filtered. You mentioned at the beginning, I think, of like a super council. Everything is filtered through this one unquestionable council. And for a council that didn't issue any anathemas, for a council that is pastoral, which doesn't mean it's completely irrelevant, but that it's not offering new doctrinal definitions or anathematizing anything, it becomes the question of, well, then it can mean anything to anyone, and therefore it's not so much about, well, you reject Vatican II. I think Francis would say, well, no, you reject me and my vision of what the church should be, of which I'm kind of scooping out of Vatican II what I'd like. And so in that same way, like, it does become this weird litmus test that it's like, well, do you accept Vatican II? And it's like, well, which parts? I mean, first of all, the documents are this long. That's why the translations of Vatican II are like here, the commentaries like there. It's like, well, which part? Am I supposed to like this idea of like a one unified world government, from Gaudium et Spes, or, the question of revelation? And what is in Vatican II that wasn't found elsewhere, even implicitly? So it just becomes this one big litmus test that judges whether you're on the right side or the wrong side. But depending on who's pope or who's in power or who you're talking to, it'll read different things, which I think is a major issue.
Yeah, somebody pointed out to me a few years ago that if you look at, like, especially papal documents, that if you look at their references, they're almost exclusively, they're from the Bible, but also then from Vatican II on. And I started, it's almost like a game I play now. When a new papal document comes out, I'm like, how many references to something pre-Vatican II that's not the scriptures. And it's unbelievable. If there's 100 references and 100 non-biblical references, 95 of them usually are from Vatican II or later. There's a weird habit of Francis of quoting himself a lot. Half his references are to his own sayings, which is a bit odd. But it just shows a certain understanding of the church that just seems to be not in keeping with the Catholic idea of tradition. I mean, everyone talks about this. I mean, the idea of tradition, that we have this 2,000 years to take from and to build upon and really to look back to. And we're only looking at these 60 years as the only thing that really matters for today. And that just seems to be a poor way of looking at. And I think your point was good also about that. When a bishop says you have to accept Vatican II, what they're really saying is you have to accept me and my way of doing things. It's not just Pope Francis, but like Supich, when he says it, or any of these bishops, and they say don't do ad orientem, it's almost like a power play. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, I'm gonna make you submit to this, which I hope they know isn't part of Vatican II, but I'm gonna call it part of Vatican II. Although I don't know, maybe they don't know. I mean, honestly, I've been a little bit surprised at times that bishops don't always know details like that. But so how do we deal then with Vatican II today in the sense of the narrative surrounding it? Like, the problem is it's such a toxic topic at this point. It just simply cannot be brought up. One of the reasons for this podcast was to try to bring it up in a way that it doesn't just become it's either completely evil or it's completely the only thing that matters. How should we as Catholics look at Vatican II and implement it kind of in our own spiritual lives and our own Catholic understanding of revelation and tradition and everything?
Well, I would say that to their credit, in the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, who I try to tell people, just because you think they're a traditionalist, they're not traditionalists.
Right.
I would say they kind of sift through the documents, which is not the same as picking and choosing what to believe in, but rather seeing which things are necessarily most pertinent. Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world, that modern world does no longer exist. That's not the world we live in. It does not, you can't search Vatican II to find something in which it talks about, these postmodern ideas of what it means to be male, female, trans, etc., or proper use of social media or whatever. Now, please, that's not me begging for a new ecumenical council to deal with these issues. I think we could take a little break for a while. But what I would say is that how to manage these narratives is, first of all, so from my personal experience, if I were teaching a class and using the catechism would cite many doctors of the church, would cite you see it like Augustine's sermons, or Aquinas, or Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, etc. And it's it could be some beautiful stuff. And I think insofar as you view Vatican II as handing on of the same faith in new language, I would feel very free, so to speak, to cite it. Some of the more thorny issues on religious liberty, or the relationship of the Catholic Church to non-Catholic communions and ecclesial communities, that could be a little thornier. The liturgy, I mean, you could read Sacrosanctum Concilium in a way that you gain so much edification through its doctrinal teaching about what the liturgy is. And I think Ratzinger said the most important part of Vatican II was the reorienting of the church in light of the Paschal Mystery. Well, you could argue that I don't think that the church forgot about the Paschal Mystery until 1962, but I do get what they're talking about, what he's talking about there. But I would say definitely the utilization of the documents to proclaim the same true old faith. But once it's viewed as kind of the updating, the aggiornamento, or the latest software update, so we're in version of the church 10.2. If you're using anything that's 10.1 or 10.0, you're you're wrong. You need to, check for updates and hit the update button. I think to use the technology analogy, that's terrible.
Right.
And that does represent the break with the past.
We see that with the teaching on the death penalty is a perfect example of that, where it's like, which version of the catechism, like the catechism I have sitting back here was the original one. So it says the death penalty is obviously admissible. And then if you have the latest version with the I didn't get the download yet, I guess. And so it's like,
don't connect to the internet.
I know I don't want to connect to the internet because I'm afraid it's going to update what I'm supposed to believe. And so
right.
It really is. I think that software analogy is great. I'm former computer programmer. That's probably why I like it so much.
Yeah.
But this idea that we're supposed to update, and you see that with the death penalty stuff, where they'll say, you just can't believe that the death penalty is admissible ever as a Catholic. It's like, you just condemned millions of Catholics, every pope until this one, because even JP2 and Benedict accepted that was acceptable. I mean, how can you do that? I mean, but like you said, it's like, we're on 10.2 now. Don't be talking about 10.1. That's old. We need to update that.
One last thing I'll mention about the narrative, or just how like it would work with the updating, is I've asked people in the past, if a Catholic in 1958, was just living their Catholic life, doing, going to mass, doing their devotions, believing the same content of faith that was taught to them, if we just discovered them in, like, let's say the Amazon rainforest, and they're still, whatever age let's say they're in good health, and they're practicing the faith like it was in 1958, is there anything of Vatican II that they need to now assent to that wasn't substantially already part of the faith that was taught to them? If the answer is yes, then I think we have a few issues. If the answer is no, then Vatican II is then seen as a reformulation, essentially, of like, when you have like patterns in the ocean where, you have in the bubbling up, and it's the same water, but, it's going through kind of different motions. If the answer is then no, like there is nothing, then I think we can move on without this narrative, like, do you accept Vatican II or not? Because it would be the same question as saying, do you accept the faith as it was taught to you? I think that if we found that kind of like person in that time capsule who just kind of is doing the 1958 thing, not saying 1958 was perfect, but at the same point, I think the question then becomes, what did Vatican II teach that would then be added to this person's software? Right. Like the software update. Can this person, using version 1958, 1958, still function as a Catholic in good standing, believing all the same stuff? Or are there now new things that Catholics need to accept? If it's the latter, then I don't really know, like, what people can then expect, because then that means that something has been added that's new, and that's not the Orthodox understanding of tradition, or really development of doctrine even.
Yeah, it becomes very much an Anglicanism where, and I mentioned this the other day on social media, where what that devolves into is always a rejection of the past. And so the person who was hip and cool and a reformer 20 years ago is now a retrograde because he doesn't accept let's say he was all pushing for women priests 20 years ago. Well, now he's not hip because he's not on board with transgendered priests or whatever.
Right.
And so when a Father James Martin or whoever is pushing for, we need to change. Well, if we really go along with that, in 50 years, his people are going to look back at him as like, he's this terrible dinosaur who should be rejected. And because by rejecting the 1958 hypothetical Catholic, that's what we end up becoming, is an Anglicanism that's constantly evolving, not reforming, not developing, but actually evolving into something different overall. And that's
right.
That's not Catholicism. I mean, that's for sure. So now I want to return real quick to one thing I said at the beginning, was when I said my first thought were failed experiment. I just want to make sure I explain that to everybody. What I mean is that I think that, and I want to hear your thoughts on this too, is when I look at Vatican II, I tend to do this. I tend to think that most of the people involved with it had good intentions. John the 23rd, most of the bishops who showed up. I'm not completely sold on the infiltration aspect of it. I don't completely deny it either. I mean, I definitely think there were some involved. Like, it's hard to look at Bunini and not say something was going on there. At the same time, I think the vast majority of the bishops there, and John the 23rd were definitely had good intentions, and they had like an idea that there maybe was something that needed to be updated because something was wrong, at least need to be reformed. And so all that was fine. And I just think ultimately what I think is that it was like a fire was starting to burn and they threw some gasoline on it, though. Instead of throwing water on it to get rid of it. It wasn't that big of a fire yet. It was there, but it wasn't that big. And then they threw gasoline on it. And that's why I would say it was a failure ultimately in achieving what it was. So it wasn't the intentions that were bad, but just the and when I say implementation, I mean the actual documents themselves at times, and then, of course, what came after that. So what would you say to that thesis? Are you kind of along that, or would you say that's kind of a little bit a bridge too far?
No, I would agree insofar as I would say what were Vatican II's, what was John the 23rd's goal, like his true goal, not the conspiracy theorist understanding that he wanted to destroy the church from within. Like what was his true goal? And if you ever read his diary, you can see he's a man of deep spirituality and deep prayer. And I don't think he was the devil incarnate like some ultra uber trads might. But what was his goal? And if it was for the church to respond to the modern world, well, a response in and of itself is neutral. You could respond to something positively, though, or negatively. And I wonder how wise it was to have the documents and the council itself focus on so many topics. Because if it was to focus on, like, let's say, the Catholic Church role in education, or the Catholic Church's role in navigating, like, let's say, peace across the world, so it's a focus topic, it's a narrow topic. But by talking about essentially everything in the church, even Vatican I didn't do that. Vatican I did not talk about, well, it also kind of ended early due to
Or Trent.
Trent, yeah, Trent's
which was a pretty comprehensive council. Trent was. I mean, in general, it was, but it wasn't anything like Vatican II in that regard.
Exactly. And so I think that, to go back, I think a failed experiment's a good way to describe it. If you're saying, well, Vatican II was an attempt to re-Christianize the world, I think it was one of the early documents of John the 23rd, or prior to the council, where he says, there's one of the biggest evils in the world is ignorance of the truth. And so if Vatican II then was the church's attempt to re-evangelize the world and to awaken devotion to Christ and Christ's church, then it was certainly a failed experiment, because both in its prudential decisions or language in the documents as to how the church should even regulate worship within herself, and the church's relationship to civil society, etc., that was just a massive failure. But I would say Vatican II then would best be understood not just as a failed experiment, but as a I don't know how to say it. Augustine, in his City of God, talks about how, like, even in today's world, the city of God and the city of man, like, yes, you could kind of distinguish, but it's essentially, there's like a commingling until the end when things are separated.
Right.
In the same way, I would view Vatican II as a commingling. There's much that is good in the documents. There's also things that are certainly questionable and that could certainly use a little clarification, doctrinal, clear clarification of what does religious liberty mean, and how are we supposed to interpret this in light of past papal condemnations, etc. Until, like, that judgment day, so to speak, where the wheat and the chaff are kind of separated, I think we're going to be living within a tension. So failed experiment, yes, but also if it helped us, I think of like the work of Scott Hahn, Matthew Levering, who certainly, we talk about accept Vatican II. They certainly accept Vatican II. I see their work as really being the fruit of the council,
Right.
but only because their work is complementing that which came before the council. Right. Didn't create a new church. If that's your vision of the council, you got it wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I know like Scott Hahn's work is a great example because it clearly is in line with Vatican II in so many ways, but it always reaches back to the tradition. And I think though Vatican II gave it a different, like if Vatican II had never happened and Scott Hahn still converted somehow, everything he'd done would be very different than it ended up being. But I think the way he did it was very good for our world and the modern world. And I think Vatican II helped him, Dei Verum particularly, helped him to clarify that. And he's just one example. There's obviously others like that, but I think that's a good example of a good fruit, as you would say, of Vatican II. So, okay, let's wrap it up here. My final question, I think you've already answered it for us. Do you think we should have a Vatican III anytime soon?
In God's time, I would, if Pope Francis announced a Vatican III, I would be filled with a lot of anxiety for many reasons. But I think it would actually be nice because the church, I forgot who wrote about it, but said like the church doesn't exist from from council to council. Like it's not like the church is gasping for air until a new council comes and gives it life. Councils arise for different reasons, but many times to respond to crises within the church, without the church or outside of the church. So I would be excited for a Vatican III if it were a focused council responding to certain issues, especially from within the church. If there were a Vatican III that was enacted to interpret Vatican II authoritatively, I'd just trust the providence of God. If there was an announcement that we're going to have Vatican III just to talk about everything under the sun, I would just try to hunker down and stay in my local church and just unplug and say, I don't need to know. First of all, I don't have the time to read all the documents that are going to come out. So whatever happens, but please God, make it a good council.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, let's wrap it up there. Hey, John, I really appreciate you coming on. This was great. I could have gone a lot longer. It's probably one of my longer podcasts because it's such a great topic and you were great. But we'll stop here. We'll stop the bleeding, so to speak. So, but I appreciate you being on. Looking forward to having you write again for Crisis soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, everybody else, until next time, God love you.